Good morning, everyone. Today we will start our new chapter of history, chapter number 1, When, Where, and How. Here are the synopses of this chapter: how India got its name, sources of building, which again classified into buildings and monuments, coins, biographies and autobiographies, travelogue, painting and artifacts. Then, after problem faced by historians, highlights of the medieval period in India. Again, it is bifurcated into growth of settlements, development of travel and trade, social changes, religious changes, political development, and at last, cultural development. So let us start the chapter. Medieval period. Medieval period is basically depend upon the condition of early medieval and later medieval period. In early medieval period, it starts from 8th century to 12th, and later medieval period starts from 13th century to 18th century. In the early medieval period, we study about Cholas, Palas, Rashtrakutas, and Rajput are as powerful dynasties. Similarly, later medieval period, we study about Turk, Afghans, and Mughals. The actual purpose of this study, we have to limit ourselves to the territory of India. But India itself underwent a lot of change in terms of territory and understanding. During this medieval period, India witnessed considerable social, economic, religious, and political changes. For an example, primary sources are as artifacts, documents, diaries, autobiographies, etc. The literary work of the medieval period, which includes the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire, roughly refers to the period from the fall of the imperial Gujrat Pratiharas to the establishment of the company rule. Thus, this period has some definite, if somewhat arbitrary, subdivisions. In those days, there were no surveyed maps. People used to tell direction by looking at celestial bodies and then the compasses. To understand what area we are going to talk about, let us see what was considered Indian territory in the past. So, the first foremost important topic is how India got its name. In the past, India has been known by different names by different people at various times. One of the early known names is the Sapt Sindhu because of the 7 rivers. So the name of the 7 rivers are Indus, Satluj, Jhelum, Beas, Ravi, Chenab, and Saraswati. The second important fact about India is the H in Persian is similar to S in Sanskrit, and thus the people of this region came to be known as Hindu from the word Sindhu. In the Rig Veda, which is as old as about 3500 years, there is a reference of being named Bharat, the civilization in that kingdom. Hindustan is the other name which is possibly from the Persian derivative. In Persian, stan to the Sanskrit word sthana means place. Again, the next point is the term Hindustan is also found in the writing of Miraj-e-Siraz, a chronicler of the 13th century. In 14th century, the poet Amir Khusro mentioned the word Hind, but it did not specify any boundaries. Similarly, in the 16th century, Babur, a famous Mughal king, used the word Hindustan to describe the geography based on fauna and the culture of the inhabitants of the subcontinent. Bharata, the name of our country, more explicitly pronounced as Bharata, is a Pali Sanskrit-based indigenous name derived from a proper name Bharat, the name of an illustrious indigenous monarch. Bharata, thus means the land of Bharata the monarch. When we look for the meanings of India, Indicus or Indi in Latin dictionary, we find that Indi means an Indian, when its derivative India means the country of Indians. The other derivative Indicus means Indian adjective, and Indi seems to the root term, and the other two are its derivatives. And at last, we can say that the name of India came to English usage from the 17th century onwards, and it is thought to be due to the influence of Latin or Spanish. The modern India or Bharat is confined to the territory which is part of entire nation. The next point is sources of history. Sources of history are classified into primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. In primary, it provides first-hand evidence gathered by the author, or they may be created or documented at the time of an event, for an example like newspaper and photographs. Secondary sources. It describe, interpret, or analyze information obtained from other sources, for an example like books and textbook. In tertiary sources, it compile and summarize mostly secondary source, for an example like encyclopedias, bibliography, etc. In sources of history, there are the following main points. For an example like building and monuments, again it is classified into important forts, mosques, temples, tombs, monuments, etc. In important forts, for an example like Gwalior Forts, Red Fort, Agra Fort, Golconda Fort and Mandu Fort. Important mosque, Jama Masjid and Moti Masjid. Temples, Briddheshwara Temple, Sun Temple, Gondal Temple and Dilwara Temple. Tombs, Humayun's tombs, Taj Mahal, Safdarjung tomb. In monuments, Qutub Minar, Charminar, etc. Coins are also considered as the sources of history. Why? The main reason is that why coins are considered as the main source of an information, because it depicts the time and date of the particular session, or we can say that it also shows the picture of the ruler of that times. Again, very important point in sources of history, bibliography and autography. Bibliography, somewhere on the basis of different research, on the basis of different scientific developments or research and methodology, we conclude in that manner that these sources are considerable related to our medieval period, which is rather early or later. In autography, for an example like Tuzuke Jahangiri by Jahangir, Aine Akbari written by Abul Fazl, Babarnama by Babar, Prithviraj Raso written by Chandra Bardai. Similarly, we can say that in travelogues like Ibn Battuta about Muhammad bin Tughlaq, Marco Polo about South India, Al-Baruni about Balban, Abdul Razak about Vijayanagara Kingdom. Same as paintings and artifacts also tell us about the different culture and religious system of medieval times. Next point, problem faced by historians. The major challenges of historical revolves around the problem of sources, knowledge and explanation, choice of subject, the peculiar problems of contemporary history. One must be aware that the phenomenon of history is not something that lies into a past or that can be distinguished from the historians of the present. Each sentence by being pronounced is already history. This insight is fundamental to the whole process of reconstructing the past, because it does not exist without the reference to those people who try to reconstruct it. This is done by selecting thoughts about the past to be described. And we can say that it is a particular process which takes place in a way that Mr. George H. has stated in his social theory. By trying to grasp the past, we also look ahead to our own, especially in conflict and controversial historical contexts, to the judgment of the expert audience. Similarly, there are many problems faced by historians on the basis of quality of source and interpretation of source. In quality of source, at that time there were no printing machines, no common language existed, and very important thing, with time they were eroded in quality and faded in color. In interpretation of source, historians are challenged by the complexity of the world and thus seek to use their knowledge of the past to help solve the problems of the present situation. The questions that can confront the historian are endless, and serious historians thus face the challenge of choosing a viable topic. Next point, highlights of modern history, which is again classified into growth of settlements, development of travel and trade, social changes, religious changes, political development and cultural development. In this we can say that history of the people, their social, economic and cultural life is certainly of great interest to the student of the history than the political events or the military campaign of any period. This is particularly true of the medieval period of Indian history. The real history of Mughal India consists in the socio-economic, cultural condition of the people of the period. During the Mughal period, particularly under Akbar's rule, India has many as 120 cities and 3,200 towns. These cities and towns different in origin and history of their growth, as well as in character from those of the Western world. While the towns and cities in the West grew centering around industry and commerce, those in India, except the port towns, most of the cities and towns grew on rural basis. Rural areas gradually developed into town or cities due to residence of rulers. Some towns also has been mentioned about grew in port areas because of the growth of warehouses and influx of indigenous and foreign merchants. Some towns also originated as business mass. What distinguished the Indian town and cities was that on the basis of these towns and cities were rural, and not only the foodstuff but also other consumer good would come into the town and cities from the rural areas. The society during the Mughal period was feudal in nature. Nobility and the official of the state were entitled to high esteem in the society. Their standard of living was very high. Luxury were their special characteristics. Apart from the kings and emperor, the noble also had their lives in different manner. From Abul Fazl, it is known that the imperial lifestyle had 5,000 women, and their life goes up to different criteria, which has been mentioned above, grew in port areas, etc. The most remarkable feature of the economic system of the Mughal was the gap that kept the producers and the consumer far as under. The producers were agriculturists, workers in the cottage industries, artisans, producer of consumer goods like oil, cloth, sugar, etc., or workers in the karkhanas. And at last we can say that the consumer were the rulers, nobles, officers, both civil and military, professional and religious classes, slaves, servants, and other people. The result was particularly in view of lack of every transport that the producer received only marginal profit, whereas the middleman and trader got the lion's share of the profit. This is largely true even today. And at last we can say that in India, the pedagogy of planning education usually start from Mohenjo-daro, Harappa period and shift to the colonial history of urbanization. And city planning is keeping an important historical time period of Indian civilization that placed the subcontinent at the global stage. Many of India's past cities were globally networked with the Roman, Persian, and other emerging global culture of that time. Deccan kingdoms that ruled little more than 4 centuries influenced the art, architecture, and city development process that attract traders from across the globe who became colonial masters over a period of time. Techniques used in the production system that existed in urban centers, especially pertaining to textile, spices, and high quality silk, got transmitted world over, generating more demand for these commodities. Consequently, perpetuating spatial spread of these urban centers. This chapter analyzes some of the elements of ancient, medieval, and colonial urbanization in the Indian context that are very important to understand how India get its name, the actual problems of the historians, sources of history, etc. This chapter starts with the great Indian controversies between the Turk, Afghans, Mughal, Rashtrakuta kingdom, Rajputs, etc. And at last we can say that yes, yes, historians are challenged by the complexity of the world and thus seek to use their knowledge of the past to help or solve the problems of the present scenario. Thank you.